Good afternoon and welcome to December's Lunch and Learn lecture. Thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting presentation. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to join the stream. Thank you so much for your patience. Hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to give our other viewers just a few more minutes to join the call, so bear with us for just a few more minutes and then we'll get things going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maddie McCauley, and I work in the Programs and Outreach Department here at Enoch Pratt Free Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn program, which Pratt hosts in partnership with Maryland State Archives and Maryland 4 Centuries Project. Before I get things started, I'd like to indicate that should you have any questions or comments for our presenter today, please enter them into the comment or chat box below the video, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. At this time, I would typically turn things over to our partner at the Maryland State Archive. However, Owen Laurie, Outreach Coordinator at Maryland State Archive, was unable to join us today. So on his behalf, I'd like to give a brief introduction for today's program. These Lunch and Learn lectures serve as an opportunity to hear stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source materials and the value of archives and libraries in uncovering our shared heritage. Our presentation today comes from Lawrence Jackson and is entitled "The Missionary, William Levington, founder of the St. James First African Protestant Episcopal Church." We hope you will also join us in the new year for our January lecture entitled "Baltimore's Own Soldiers in World War I, No Longer Lost to History," happening on January 9th at 1 p.m. For more information about this and other programs, including recordings of past presentations, check out the Maryland State Archives website at msa.maryland.org or prattlibrary.org. Without further ado, let me turn things over to Bert Kermerow, founding director of the Maryland 4 Centuries Project, to introduce today's speaker. Take it away, Bert.
Thanks so much, Maddie, and welcome all to our final Lunch and Learn lecture of 2024. We are pleased to work with our two great partners, the Enoch Pratt Library and the Maryland State Archives, and we bring you the best new research into Maryland's fascinating history. Now, stay tuned for our great Lunch and Learn lineup in the works for 2025 as we prepare for the 2026 US 250th anniversary. Because the Maryland's Four Centuries Project is in the anniversary business, we are looking forward to all the upcoming anniversaries. The US 250th in 2026, Baltimore's 300th in 2029, and Maryland's very special 400th in 2034. Right now, the US 250th is looming, and we're aiming at getting some quality attention for Maryland's important role in the nation's history. Having found 150 Maryland historic firsts, both here in the state and in the entire country, we have been struck by the African American quest, still unfinished, for civil rights and citizenship in our border state. 52 of our Maryland Mosaic firsts are focused on African American people, places, and events in all 23 counties in Baltimore City. Those firsts and that history, with all of its successes and setbacks, should be an important signature to the 2026 events. Now, today's lecture gets to the heart of Maryland's African American history. The prize-winning PBS specials put together by Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. often emphasizes the important role of the Black church in giving that community strength and cohesion through its struggles. When the deacon and later Reverend William Levington came to Baltimore in 1824, he wanted to bring religion to the Black residents of the city. His mission brought the first Black church south of the Mason-Dixon line. Now, he established St. James' first African Protestant Episcopal church on a second floor in the city with the blessing of Maryland's white bishop. The next year, with donated land and bricks, a new church was created at North, later Guilford, and Saratoga Streets. And Levington would consecrate that church in 1827. He started a school for Black children who were denied entry to public schools, and he invited enslaved as well as free Blacks in divided pre-Civil War Baltimore to worship at St. James. But I will let our speaker tell this inspiring story. Dr. Lawrence Jackson, with the impressive position at Johns Hopkins University as the Michael Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History, has a special connection to the story. Born and raised in West Baltimore, he is a member of the St. James Parish. Dr. Jackson has focused on the rich history and culture of Baltimore and Maryland, and especially he has done so much good work on the iconic singer Billie Holiday. His connections with St. James are particularly valuable. My wife Mary and I were honored to be present at a special 200th anniversary service at St. James Church. During that service, the former rector, the recently retired Episcopal presiding bishop and primate Michael Curry, was presiding. A beautifully preserved 1832 tapestry related to William Levington was also unveiled. Our speaker had a primary role in bringing that tapestry from its owner, Colonial Williamsburg, on loan to St. James for the 200th anniversary. Join me in giving a hearty welcome to Baltimore's native son, Dr. Lawrence Jackson.
Thanks very much, Bert, and thanks, Madeline, for arranging the talk today. I'm just going to go through a series of slides and make some remarks about the early history of the St. James Church and William Levington. And I've been doing some research at a little bit of depth, I would say, just sort of on Levington's life and his work in early national United States. So the talk, just, calling it William Levington and the founding of the St. James First African Protestant Episcopal Church. That was the formal name of St. James when it was founded, and I suppose also chartered, because Levington created a constitution. And this would have been in 1827, just as also as he was elevated and became a reverend. But Levington was born in New York, where slavery ended in 1827. He seems to have been born in 1793. We don't have any documents, really attesting not only to the date, but also to the place. He could have been born in New York City, in Manhattan. He could have been born in one of the other boroughs. He also could have been born upstate. One of his early relationships that I'll talk a little bit more about might suggest that he was born not so far from a place called Beekman on the eastern side of the Hudson River, but he certainly spent a good portion of his life working, teaching, and preaching on the Hudson River area, sort of between, or I guess in the general ambit of Albany and Schenectady. So it sort of stands to reason that he might have originally been from that area. But as Bert's already mentioned, he was the first Black priest working in the American South. And so if you notice these two items, it sort of blurred all my slides today.
Lawrence, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but unfortunately we're unable to see your slides. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we're able to see the slides. Oh, hold on just a second. Thank you all for your patience. If you could just give me a verbal cue of next slide whenever you're ready, that would be great for me to advance when it comes on, okay?
So my presentation is disconnected, though. It said, so I should look at what you have then. Is that right? Shoot. Okay. Okay. All right. If you look at the bottom of the opening page, excuse me, I made some changes. I tried to get out all of my errors from an earlier presentation. You can see a red marking, and this is from the Episcopalian Church Convention. And, if you can imagine, this is a list of all of the ministers in the Episcopalian Church in the United States. And so the largest number of ministers were from New York, and Maryland is right behind New York. It's like a church really of New York, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And I would suggest to you all in the audience that Levington having his name listed, and unfortunately, right, it's so small I can't read it for you, so you have to read it for yourselves. But his the particular language is fascinating, right? It says the Reverend William Levington, a colored man, minister of St. James Church, Baltimore, the congregation of which is composed of colored persons, right? So it was going to be really significant that it was known that Levington, who was unable or barred from these conventions, but that it was known that he was actually a legitimate and ordained Episcopalian minister, a minister of the gospel. And so, if you think about early national U.S., where it's not as if you have African Americans really working as attorneys at law or as officers of the court, and not really where you would have. Baltimore had a tradition of a man named Wells. Somebody probably knows his full name. I'm blanking on his name right now. Who was understood as like a doctor of Negroes, and probably did attend to some white patients, but would not have been necessarily, like a graduate of a medical college. But I'm trying to suggest that you have very, very few professional African Americans, and Levington's being included by name on the roster of ordained ministers of the Episcopal Church was really quite a powerful a powerful document that I would suggest he probably could use in many creative ways to the benefit of Black people and Black freedom. The other image is from the Afro-American newspaper at the end of the 19th century, and it's their rendering of the early St. James Church. And we sort of have two competing versions of what that church on North Street looked like. I tend to believe that this is the one we should probably use to inspire our imaginations. But, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So now we'll go to slide number 2. Levington came to Baltimore from Philadelphia, and he was a dues-paying or a pew rent-paying member of the famous St. Thomas congregation, which is the first congregation of Black Episcopalians. The St. Thomas Church, is founded by the gentleman in the portrait, Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is more or less the father of Black Christianity in the United States. And it's sort of with Absalom Jones and his, friend and sort of co-religious partner, Richard Allen, that the African Methodist Episcopal denomination was founded. There's another person from Maryland who was integral in that early church, and I'll mention him, Daniel Coker, a little bit later. But Levington joined St. Thomas around the time that Absalom Jones died. In fact, he might have been there prior to Jones's death. He may have known Jones himself. Again, Jones would be the first African-American Episcopalian priest, followed by Peter Williams, followed by William Levington. And this group of Black freed people, that would have included like the sailmaker Thomas Forton, who was the wealthiest Black American in the colonial era. They were an incredibly progressive and intellectually astute group. And so Levington is there in 1818 and 1819. These are the earliest records that we have of William Levington, the St. Thomas Parish Register records that show him paying dues. And he's living in the home of a man who is a bookseller named Potter. And this is a, sort of a famous portrait of Philadelphia city life, 3rd and Market. And if you modeling, are we any closer on this, or I'm not sure what people are seeing or how well they can see it? Like, do they see the full slide, or they have to?
Are you able to see full screen, or are you only seeing it when it's in this PowerPoint view? I'm so sorry that this is being an issue.
I'm seeing it as a quarter of a screen in PowerPoint. but the point that I want to make is just that if you look at the details of the Birch illustration, you can see that there are many figures of African descent depicted on the street scene in Philadelphia, where you would have had a lot of black vendors. The oyster men often are African American, and Birch. Philadelphia is going to be ground zero for the development of the anti-black caricatures of urban freed people that will emerge in the 1830s, especially. And but one of the features of American city life would also have been really a almost a destitute class of African Americans, right? It's sort of noted throughout most of the representations that we have of travel literature in American cities. And Birch has, sort of like African Americans with their hands clasped, sort of in the portrait of seeking alms. But life for Black free people could sometimes be incredibly difficult because it was almost impossible to join the skilled trades, especially if you, were emerging from enslavement at the end of the Revolutionary period. There were some mass manumissions, and people, moved to or attempted to get closer to cities. Urban life was traditionally easier. Of course, there really was no opportunity for you in places where slavery was still thriving in the rural areas. But it was quite difficult to make a living in a place like Philadelphia. Levington is supposed to have been the household servant in Potter household, where he became very close with a young person. Can we go to the next slide, Madeline? Or are we seeing any slides at all? Okay, yeah, then we can see Alonzo Potter, who, was or became one of Levington's closest friends. But the relationship with Potter, who was about 7 to 10 years younger than Levington, maybe was one with other kinds of obligations. I don't know. The one portrait of Potter's, sort of like an early biography written towards the end of the 19th century, would simply suggest that Levington was a servant. And in the letters that Potter wrote to other clergy in the Northeast, he is supportive, but, you would also imagine that there's a considerable amount of distance, especially when he is describing Levington's abilities as a clergyman or as an intellectual. But nonetheless, Alonzo Potter was a steadfast supporter of William Levington's. And when Potter moved to Schenectady and took on a job as a professor at Union College, where he graduated, and then he also became the minister of the St. George Episcopalian Church there. Levington, too, began work in upstate New York, or, so I guess it's maybe Albany's kind of middle state, up the Hudson River in New York. When he began working up there in Schenectady and in Albany, he too led in school teaching for the small African-American population, and then also in as a clergyman to, sort of a Black population that would have been scattered among different farms, and from time to time bringing these groups into the Episcopalian Church, either, sort of like in Schenectady or in Albany. I mean, both of them, sort of these Hudson River towns. But this figure here in the middle, Bishop William White, who was, more or less like the founder or the great convener of the Episcopalian Church in the United States, which is the Church of England, without homage to the king, without, sort of shorn of its British and somewhat or mildly, maybe less so, it's some of its aristocratic leanings or pretensions. But William White was the major figure. He's the third consecrated bishop, but was really the first bishop of the United States. He was the Bishop of Pennsylvania, and then he will go on to have such an important role in the creation of Black Episcopalian parishes. I believe that he may also have ordained Peter Williams. I can't tell you 100% right now, but certainly he ordains Jones, and then also will be the person who is most crucial in Levington's religious life. And so we'll go on to the next slide.
Lawrence, you're driving now. So you're going to click to the next slide.
So these are mine now?
Yes.
Mine? Okay. Oh, okay, great. All right. Oh, this is perfect. So, Levington came to Baltimore in 1824, and if you look at this sort of panoramic, this is like a classic romantic early national period vista of Baltimore. You sort of get the basin and the steamboat, the emerging industries, or maybe even the consolidation of sort of like these industries. This idea, it's Federal Hill, and we have, this sort of grand park and the grand view of the city. We can see here in the distance, we'll get the, where are we? It should be, it should be, this is the Basilica, maybe that is the monument, but it would be also like the spire of the St. Paul's Church, which you would see from, sort of the bottom of Charles Street. And I have these other images because, the thing about, these sort of romantic versions of the city that, are being produced at the end of the 1820s and especially in the 1830s, late 1830s and 1840s, typically they will omit, what real city life actually looks like. And if you look at this, sort of a hasty drawing by Latrobe, John Latrobe, in 1832, and we see sort of the edges of this image at one of the markets, the Center Street Market. You'll see even, sort of with the, just a pencil drawing, right? Sort of the woman of African descent with the basket of fruits and vegetables on her head. So Black market sellers are ubiquitous throughout the city. In fact, people are always concerned that you have too many African Americans, sort of making fires and roasting food on the street corners by the markets. Very much a Black city life that would square with what we would think about for Baltimore's inner city of today, but especially the city inside of Martin Luther King Boulevard, or sort of south of Franklin Street.
Lawrence, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're currently seeing a black screen. So if you had entered into a full screen mode or something like that, could you try to click out of that for us? Because this slide, we haven't been able to see anything on this slide. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I was talking about this one. And I was talking about the woman here for the right of my screen. Even these like lithographs of Battle Monument would have African Americans. Just a few people. Everybody is sort of a a representative type. Would have African Americans here at the Center of Battle Monument, and then oystermen working the waters. So, you would have had a lot of African Americans working, sort of on kind of like both sides of the docks, like the Fells Point side and then the Baltimore town side. To be in the city and walking city streets meant that you were encountering a significant portion of the Black population here in Baltimore. Really always around a quarter of the city's population, and in 1830 of the 18,910 people. It's important to remember that 75% of them, 80% of them are free. So the tradition in Baltimore, the thing about Frederick Douglass emerging from this city, and Frederick Douglass as always being a person who sort of chafed against bondage. It was a natural disposition that he acquired in the city, where the ordinary Black person was a freed woman or freedman. So this tradition of Black liberty here in Baltimore is something that I think we're going to see historians dealing with to a greater extent as we go forward. Levington came to a city in sort of like what I would describe almost as like a fertile crescent. But these, this sort of crescent-shaped ambit includes the important, either institutions, churches, or homesteads that he would have been, sort of in or around on at least a weekly basis. And if you go from this point here, fairly close to the Jones Falls, which of course during his era, was sort of crossed with maybe a half a dozen bridges, interspersed, sort of from the water's edge, up to John Edgar Howard's woods, which, were sort of like the big barrier and the end of the city. But we have the Bethel AME Church, right? This is the first independent Black congregation. They're going to get there around after 1816. The next star is the St. James Church on North Street, South Street below Baltimore. And then when you cross Baltimore, it becomes North Street, today Guilford Avenue at North and Saratoga. 3 blocks up the hill is Old St. Paul's, the parent church to St. James, and where, sort of Levington, will have some of his earliest Baltimore moments. And then just sort of 2.5, 3 blocks away down Liberty Street towards Park Avenue, Park Street then. And the intersection was Dutch Alley. That's the upper room that Bert mentioned earlier, where we have the very first religious services conducted. And then about 4 blocks down, over and down somewhat, on Howard Street is where it's the one place that we know that Levington has a household. So where, apparently, like when he has his choice to make his own house, this is the neighborhood that he's, selecting or, seem to make the best sense. And this is it's fascinating to me because, sort of like right at Howard Street and Lombard Street, you're beginning to move into another African-American world. We're getting into the South Baltimore Black community. And especially the intersection, say, of like, I think that Camden Street and Sharp Street would be very important. And then also like Sharp Street and Little Montgomery Street. But Sharp Street and the Sharp Street United Methodist Church today, or the Sharp Street Methodist Church at that time, were in some ways sort of like the fountainhead of like a resisting Black community, a politically aggressive, not just progressive, but a politically aggressive community. And of course, on the one hand, at the edge of this boundary, that is sort of cut out for our presentation, you're going to have the jails and pens for enslaved people who are being sold to Charleston and to New Orleans. We believe that there are about 12 to 12,500 people who are sold from Baltimore City, from the Broadway Street Wharf, sometimes on steamboats, the industrial world and the world of slavery or transatlantic slave trade, totally overlapping. But then, just sort of 2 blocks over, you have the Sharp Street Church, which is, again, the origin really of organized African-American Christianity. And the final square here that we want to designate is the William Watkins School on Camden Street. And sort of between the two figures, Levington and William Watkins are leading the most important Black schools in the 1820s and 1830s. Public school in Baltimore is created in 1829. So there had been a tradition of Black education here with an African academy led by Daniel Coker that goes back to the first decade of the 19th century. But I'm saying all this to say that this section here of Camden and Sharp Street was a real habitus for the Black elites of the time, who would have been the barbers. Those were the most well-to-do African Americans. I mean, in some ways, barbering and morticians, continue to be the backbone of a Black entrepreneurial class. But you would have found thousands of Black people in the 1830s or by the 1830s living in this section of the city, and it was, just incredibly important. I took these pictures. I think I had jury duty on Tuesday. So Tuesday afternoon, I was walking away from the courthouse and I took this shot of the St. Paul's Rectory. Now, this would have been the first place I think that Levington went, as however he got to Baltimore, whether it's by land or whether it was by boat. One route from Philadelphia to Baltimore would have been, you take a stage to Elkton, and then you go up the Elk River or down the Elk River to the Chesapeake Bay, and then into the Patapsco River from there. But this is probably a building that Levington entered, or maybe even frequented. This is certainly where his relationship with Bishop James Kemp began. Kemp was a slave owner, as slavery or slaveholding was widespread among Episcopalians, though it was there were multiple debates, sort of maybe mainly about the nature of the kind of slavery, and then the speed of manumission. But certainly Kemp, who died in 1827, was a slaveholder, sort of throughout his life. I learned 2 days ago the name of one of the people that lived, I believe probably lived here, may not have lived here, but was owned by Kemp, a woman named Leah. Kemp, when he worked in Talbot County, or was the parish priest in Talbot County, was known for his stand against slavery, or, certainly his preaching and writing that, it was not possible in good conscience to, sort of hold people in bondage or to be abusive. So, in spite of, what we can see are obvious contradictions and the fact that he was a slaveholder, he had a role as an advocate for Levington. Without his permission, Levington would have been unable to have served as the Reverend at St. James. So Levington meets him and carries with him a letter. This will be delivered to you by William Levington, a colored man whom I lately ordained a deacon, right? This is from William White. Mr. Thompson has taken great pains in his preparation with considerable effect. He is unfortunate in points of utterance, which will always be in a way of his popularity. Now, this is something I'm still sort of puzzling over, like what is being indicated by this line. But, among some of the things that might be suggestive was that Levington was not so well beloved in Philadelphia because, he had a point of view that urban freed people did not enjoy. And one person who they did enjoy was a guy named Prince Saunders. And Saunders was well known for kind of like putting on airs and being very pretentious, definitely very erudite sounding, fond of quoting, sort of Greco-Roman antiquity or, his reading list. And Levington was not like that. I believe that he was, a more plain-spoken and direct person. But in any event, that was one thing that concerned William White as Levington, sort of came south to create the church. But it was with Kemp's, help that he was able to basically, gather the parish and then to be able to build the church. And this is one of the Latrobe watercolorings of St. Paul's from the church from the 1820s, which sort of stood between 1817 and 1854. And here we have another one. I love this 1858 Saxe projection map. Again, in color or in three colors. Really gives you a sense. I mean, they used to call Baltimore, some people call Baltimore, like the Venice of America, and in some ways that its waterways were very attractive. There were always sort of competing views about sort of how attractive the Jones Falls was or was not. I think I read in the newspaper about. During Levington's era, maybe it was in the 1840s, and it was like the police or the constable, they were getting people out of the falls and they didn't want them bathing there, and all of the other things that other parts of human life that went into the falls. But we can certainly see Levington's world again, and just sort of giving you the Battle Monument is here, Charles Street's there, Holiday Street is here, here's North Street, and then the church on the northeast corner, and then, sort of Old St. Paul's would be, sort of up this way. One thing that was noteworthy about Levington's, sort of world, and, I encourage everybody to walk around, sort of the Saratoga Street, Liberty Street area, cross section. I mean, very close to the main branch of the Enoch Pratt Library, because of the, let's say, the interruption of so many of the multi-story commercial buildings at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The creation of Preston Gardens, that was the first use, I believe, in the United States of eminent domain by a city to transform a neighborhood. And that was a mostly Black neighborhood there at Preston Gardens. But it was certainly a very dense city, or an increasingly dense city that Levington knew, one that was, sort of overflowing with 1.5 story and 2-story brick houses. And it was from that community that Levington would draw the members of the St. James Church. There are some who were exceptionally noteworthy. I'll mention one shortly, but one that I don't mention would be like the family of William T. Greener, who was the first African-American to graduate from Harvard College. Greener was born in Philadelphia and grew up in Philadelphia, but his father and his grandfather were Baltimoreans connected to the St. James Church. Presumably, Greener's father would have gotten some counsel from Levington about leaving Baltimore and moving to Philadelphia. But I would suggest that there would be more than one examples of that sort of legacy and heritage at St. James. It's sort of interesting. I'm showing an image here, again, made by Edward Clay. It's probably the one example or is believed to be by Edward Clay, It's probably the one example in some of these works that are done by Philadelphia illustrators in the 1830s where they're satirizing the Black freed community. Again, a certain segment of the white community is opposed to sharing public space with freed people, and is always trying to ridicule the pretensions of freed people to dress and to conduct themselves, sort of like urbanites, cosmopolitan urbanites. But if you understand the in some ways the pretension of a person like Frederick Douglass, by the time he is 18 years old, he is working, moonlighting, I guess, as a butler at a house on maybe Monument Street, maybe it's on Baltimore Street, and Douglass was always seeking to have on the raiment, the clothes of the freed person. If you think of it's only a handful of images of Anna Douglass, always very finely attired. But Levington would have been, sort of interested in like a very advanced looking group of Black Americans. And it was with the help of so many of the members of the Old St. Paul's Church that they began sort of putting in the newspaper these solicitations trying to win monetary gifts to build the church in 1825 and 1826. I also have this, it's a tintype, not a daguerreotype, so excuse the typo there, of sort of a nearby urban enslaved woman, Martha Ann Atavis. So this is one example of a Black person that we know was living in the city, sort of during this time, during this era. There's also another article here, a little snippet where you can see like a Sun paper brief portrait of a Black woman who was a member of St. James, and she's supposed to have been walking to church, and she's over 100 years old. I mentioned the sort of like a little controversy over what the church actually looked like. George F. Bragg, who was he's born in North Carolina, but he moved to Petersburg, Virginia when he's 2 years old. So he's really a Virginian in his training and outlook. He comes to Baltimore and then becomes probably the most important priest of St. James after Levington. Bragg led the church for maybe 40 years, and he took the church from where they're sharing a parish with another denomination to building a church on at Park Avenue and Preston Street, and then even getting the church to its current location. And so in Bragg's publication, he includes this picture of Old St. James Church. And this is, of course, about 10 years after the Afro's publication. Now, Bragg was kind of like a co-publisher and co-creator of the Afro, which combined a newspaper that he was publishing. So he was also an active journalist. But because the church itself was built in about 7 or 8 months, I suspect that it was, probably a plainer design than what he included. But, the controversy, I don't think it's any closer to ending. St. James was always in the 19th century really in pursuit of funds to maintain the property and to keep it open. And the church was always dealing with significant challenges. So, this sort of opening consecration in 1827 and, sort of the marvel of being open. But then after Levington's death, 10 years later, I believe he probably did die in 1837 and maybe not 1836. But, after his death, just sort of very difficult maintaining the basic dimensions of the physical plant. So you have them in 1849, again, seeking, sort of significant help to improve and maintain the church. And this would be true, sort of throughout the Civil War era. And then by the time somebody like Bragg gets there in the at the very end of the 1880s, the church is supposed to be in very bad disrepair and was not salvageable. I mentioned the important figure in the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, and then also the founder of the African Academy here in Baltimore, Daniel Coker. And one of the things that I think is really significant about Coker, who probably, never met Levington. If he met Levington, it would have been like, say, at Absalom Jones's funeral in 1818 in Philadelphia. Maybe, could have crossed paths in Philadelphia in 1818 or 1819. Coker leaves the United States for West Africa, for modern-day Sierra Leone in 1820. He takes a group of Black pilgrims, or, people who were leaving the United States for the possibility of another kind of freedom in West Africa. But he's especially noteworthy because he published the first pamphlet opposing slavery, or sort of rationalizing the inevitability of freedom, a debate between a slaveholder and an abolitionist in essence. It's the first publication of its kind in the South. So we just always want to remember that this was it was a really remarkable group of freed people, and that some of the persons who were educated there, became outstanding figures in antebellum America. And so I mentioned William Watkins, who is the uncle and the tutor to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who will have her 200th anniversary next September, and who was the major Black female writer of the 19th century, right? A poet, a short story writer, a fiction writer, an essayist, a suffragette, an abolitionist figure. Her uncle, William Watkins, was also a very prominent abolitionist, publishing anonymously in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator and leading an important school. And he was a sharp critic of Black gradualists, people who, thought that they could possibly make important institutional ties, often with slaveholders. Sometimes people like William Levington. William Douglas, who is from Montgomery Street, was the first ordained Black clergyman in the American South. So he is going to go on to become the rector of the St. Thomas Church. What was thought the most prestigious position for an African-American clergyman, and was known by Levington's friend Alonzo Potter, and was thought to have an outstanding intellect, and was also thought not to have a peer as a reader of the Episcopalian liturgy. Douglas was understood as basically a genius. A person who, from an incredibly modest background, I think that his parents had attained freedom but were not born free themselves, really reached the heights of, what he was pursuing. And then there's the famous portrait thought to be Coker by Joshua Johnson. So Levington, was successful in getting the church underway, built and consecrated by the spring of 1827. He worked laboriously with a school population, maybe 60 to 100 students, regular day students. That's how he earned his living. He was always working gratuitously, never received a salary as an Episcopalian minister. But by the time you get into, this is true in the 1820s as well. I don't mean to suggest that there's some kind of sea change after the Nat Turner revolt in 1831, but the middle 1830s was an especially acute point in, what we would call race relations. The publication in multiple editions of David Walker's Appeal, right? This fiery Boston Black abolitionist who is basically writing these articles to Black people, insisting that it is their duty to resist enslavement, and especially calling into question the religious, the St. Paul's letters, right? The religious righteousness of slavery, the argument about Black barbarism, or the ancestral barbarism that Blacks are supposed to have from Africa. Really tearing all of the arguments to shreds and insisting that it's the duty of Black men and women to oppose enslavement with all the means at their disposal. And then also in 1834 and in 1835, you have these riots in northern cities. You've got a lot of riots in Baltimore, though they do not wind up being explicitly about sort of Black-white conflict. But Peter Williams Church in New York is threatened and, maybe is very close to being destroyed. You have, these significant riots in Philadelphia really throughout the 1830s. Where, sort of white mobs are aggressively seeking to displace Black neighborhoods. Arson is being used. And so, in this environment, you have Levington working with the ministers from these other prominent churches, Bethel and Sharp Street, to allay the concerns of the, you might say, the genteel white public. This letter is not some of these writings are not directed, sort of at the mobs or, sort of the people who would have been brutal to Black people no matter what. But rather, you can see them attempting to present a Black elite community, though Bethel and Sharp Street, they have thousands of members on their rolls. St. James, we don't have extant parish registers or rolls, but it seems as if St. James would have had, maybe 100 or maybe 150 regular attendees of the services. But you can see the ministers getting together and, sort of saying that, so we can emphatically say that we believe that not only the congregations over which we preside, but the other colored congregations also of this city and vicinity and the colored population generally are on the side of peace and good order, and are determined with the blessings of God to pursue the same blameless course of conduct as heretofore. In other words, we're not radicals, we're not domestic servants who are going to cut the throats of the masters, we're not going to burn down the city, we're not going to poison the water. How can we present ourselves as, sort of trustworthy and obedient citizens? I don't know if my mom is on our Zoom call now, but she gave me an important lesson, among many, right? But she said civil, not docile. And I think that is an important distinction, that they emphasizing the civil rights claims of free African citizens, free Afro-American citizens in Baltimore. And you can think of these sort of this bridge building efforts made by Levington. And I think that's one way to consider one of the bridge building efforts that he's most famously known for. And that, of course, is the sampler that Levington created in 1832 as a gift to James Bosley, who had donated the land that they built the original St. James Church at North and Saratoga on. Bosley made the donation, and then there was another donation of bricks, and they were able to get underway. And Levington, on July 4th, 1832, sort of made a gift of a decorative tapestry. It's sort of it seems to have been a part of the curriculum of the school, where they were doing some teaching, or there are other tapestries that are still extant that, seem to have been accomplished either at the school or by alumni of the school. But it's sort of a remarkable, relic, maybe, showing characteristics or features of Levington that we just wouldn't have had access to all the other things that we know that he did and must have done. This is somebody who was also an adept artisan or craftsperson, who was working with needle and silk thread and produced something that is still in excellent condition today, and that we were really delighted to be able to share with the public for a brief period of time in June and July of this year. I mentioned, I'm still doing a little more work on this slide. You don't see the obituary. The newspapers from 1837 carry Levington's obituary, so I think that that's probably accurate. There are a lot of reasons why his headstone might have said 1836, and few people would have had access to sort of the run of the of a newspaper. But I don't know, and maybe some of us on the call do know the location of the original burying ground for the parishioners of the St. James Church, or the early church. I think that's one of the places where we really want to do some more, or as much research as we can, with the early burial grounds in Baltimore. And I know that we have a lot of really good work that's going on, like with the Mount Laurel Cemetery, and then also with the cemetery in I think Mount Auburn Cemetery in South Baltimore. There's one African cemetery that I'm very curious about that would have been like on I think it would have been like on Austin Street, just one block north of Russell Street, and almost directly in front of the entrance to the M&T Bank Stadium today. That's also another sort of interesting area for some of our future research. But Levington seems to have lived like on Howard Street in a somewhat large household with a woman who was about his age and with several children. And so it's not known. I mean, we suspect, or we think, that Levington had a family, but if it's true, very little has survived about what happened to those people after his death. And one of the things that I think is so significant, and so interesting about the position of the St. James Church, again, which is going to be torn down about, I think it's about 1897 that it actually comes down. This is a 1890 Sanborn Fire Insurance map, sort of gives you very, very precise detail about the city. The section on North Street was going to be like really, really important for the Black community. Union Baptist Church would move, almost cat a corner to St. James by the shortly after the Civil War. You're also going to get the foundation of the Douglas Society, or I think they called it the Douglas Institute, that was going to be on Lexington Street at North Street. Colored High School would be on also, sort of right here in the same section. So it remained, the North Street, sort of hub remained kind of like the center of Black gravity. And you do get a sense of that from this, really important 1870 photograph of the celebration of the passage of the 15th Amendment. And Frederick Douglass is supposed to be there, on the dais. There have been parades circling through the city all day long. And it's supposed to be the largest gathering of African Americans in the Western Hemisphere up to that point. But people aren't coming from so very far to get there. The neighborhood up Calvert Street and up North Street and up St. Paul Street, I think it was called Cortlandt Street at the time, those are going to become maybe off of those large boulevards, right, on the alley streets and the smaller side streets. I mean, those will become the most important throughways for a very, very large and successful post-Civil War, post-bellum Black group. And I mentioned earlier that the creation of Preston Gardens I think it opens in 1915, or that's when the eminent domain is declared. It's under Mayor Preston. That displacement, that's, again, the early evidence, early example of, what maybe would have just been called slum clearance at that time, will move the Black population up Center Street and, beginning the great migration up McCullough Street and Druid Hill Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue. And then you see a transformation of the Black community from, sort of a central city community to, what was called at that time the Northwest. But nonetheless, St. James, I think had a great role to play in that, the establishment of the Black community in the neighborhood around City Hall. And then Bert also mentioned, this really incredible kind of fact, sort of as I conclude, which is that, the role of the church, was actually, it's been quite stunning, and it's been quite remarkable, so that at the installation of Richard Meadows as the Reverend at St. James in 2023, it was a ceremony conducted by the primate of the Episcopalian Church, Michael B. Curry, who had also been the rector at St. James, and the Bishop of Maryland, Eugene Sutton, and that you have 3 Black men in these positions and roles. And so, there's such a powerful thread from St. James to the modern day church. I mean, from the parish to the heights of the church. And if anybody is interested in reading more about some of the features of St. James in the 19th or the 20th century, I write about this, or, there's a published work in Shelter where you can see or, read a little bit more about some of the details. And some of those pieces were published, like in the Paris Review in 2021, right before the publication of the book. So, I encourage you, if you want to go further, that'll give you a few more details. But I would like to, I'll sort of conclude with this slide, and I think now we have time for questions. I hope everybody, could stay in there and got a chance to see some of the slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. This was a lovely presentation. Again, thank you everyone for your patience and sticking in it as we work through some technical difficulties. I really thoroughly enjoyed all of the wonderful primary sources that you included, Lawrence. That was really wonderful and really added to today's lecture. And please, if you do have any questions, please pop that in the chat. And I do have one question for you, Lawrence. When in reference to the sampler that you had, did you come across any other St. James physical artifacts during your research process? Because that was a really interesting physical artifact that you highlighted.
Nothing so far, Madeline.
Okay.
Needle in a haystack is, probably an apt kind of metaphor. On the other hand, I would say that we prepared an exhibit at the Episcopalian Cathedral at the Diocesan Center for the Maryland Church. And let's say we reproduced a dozen items: historic maps, the St. James Constitution, the different things that appeared in the newspaper about Levington's life that, I don't know, were easy to find, or I knew about a couple of the excerpts from the letters discussing Levington between William White and James Kemp. But over the summer, I started going through more of the religious records, and I mentioned stumbling across Levington's name as a rent payer or pew paying member of the St. Thomas Church in Philadelphia. And so it seems to me that there very well may be far more pieces of evidence than might have been imagined previously. But relative to artifacts, so far there's nothing that I'm aware of. Though the community in Baltimore, I mean, great historians and great lovers and preservers of history, and so I'm sure there are so many people who've been sort of thinking about these questions much longer than I have. Even though I'm born and raised in the city and in Maryland, it wasn't until I returned in 2016 that I really ever thought much about Maryland at all. So it's just been a nonstop learning experience for me.
Yeah. Several of the key players that you mentioned today have a connection between Baltimore and Philadelphia. Is that common, or is that a specific Philadelphia-Baltimore connection?
I would say that it is somewhat common. Baltimore is the third largest city for much of the era of time that I'm talking about, or, if you're thinking about the 1820s and 1830s. And, it's kind of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, marking so much of that early national historical period. And I don't know how they did it easily, but apparently, the circuit of travel, made it possible or made it ordinary, to sort of move. I wouldn't describe it as a comfortable movement, but to move along these riverway cities, I guess is another way of considering it. But the relationships, as you have observed, they were quite strong.
Yeah. Our last question for today is: does Professor Jackson anticipate that more information on William Livingston's family and possibly a photo or drawing will be found? They also wanted to say that this was an excellent presentation and amazing information was provided.
Oh, thanks very much. I was I should say this. Okay, yeah. Here's something. Jeez, and where was this? I had no idea at all what Levington looked like, and then shoot. I'm sorry. I have to go to another file to tell you exactly where this is. But let's say it's written by William White, but I don't think it was. It must be one of White's letters to Kemp. So those materials are at the Episcopalian Archives on University Parkway in the Diocesan Center. So no idea at all what Levington looked like, and then lo and behold, Kemp writes, he is a true African in appearance. And so, I'm sorry I didn't work that in earlier, right? I should say that because, Coker was biracial. Coker's mother is a white woman. I can't remember how the relationship begins with the father, but it's, I would say that it's a situation kind of similar to Benjamin Banneker's grandmother, who is sentenced to the colonies, and she's able to serve out her sentence, and then she somehow becomes connected, maybe owned a man from, seems to be a Bambara guy, and they hit it off, and then they start to have children. But Levington was a looking black man, and I would be astounded if we ever found an image that could possibly be his likeness. But I think maybe more to the point, the other side of this is that he would have been, completely singular and noted so many places that he went. And there very, very, very well may be some image, some place, even if it is of the most cursory sort. The image that I showed of William Watkins there was just like a remote reference, like there might be an image of William Watkins, and I scoured the AME Church Review, and eventually, sort of I came across that that portrait. So in other words, I won't give up looking, but I don't expect much, or maybe not in my lifetime, but maybe we'll find something.
Great. Well, thank you again, Lawrence, for an informative and engaging presentation. Thank you to our partners at the Maryland State Archive and the Maryland 4 Centuries Project. And thank you to Gateway Interpreting for providing accessibility for today's program. And lastly, thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon. Stay safe and take care. Everyone have a good rest of the afternoon. Wonderful job, Lawrence. I am sorry that was a wild ride.
But eventually people could see the slides.